Ever since I rediscovered Root Letter, one of my favorite visual novels, I've been on a little kick in wanting to play more of the genre. I've actually been eyeing one specific game for a very long time, ever since I heard that it was coming to the Switch and in English. After having spent a nice long time going through and really enjoying the story, here is my review of a visual novel with a lot of controversy around it, If My Heart Had Wings, for the Nintendo Switch. This story is centered around a high school student who goes back to his hometown after injuring himself while cycling. Upon arriving still in a deep depression, he makes 3 fateful encounters with a childhood friend, a wheelchair-ridden girl who lives in the dormitory he's going to work at, and the last member of an aviation club at school trying to fulfill the dreams of the previous club members. After hearing about the dreams of flying a glider plane through a legendary cloud formation called the Morning Glory, the 4 come together, revitalize the club, and start working on a glider plane to fulfill that dream. The overall story of this game is really good because there's a lot of comedy, a lot of technical information about glider planes and aviation, and a lot of romance thrown into the mix. The game does this pretty well because it's divided into 2 halves. The first half of the game is the common route that sets up everything from the characters to the actual story, and there are several versions of the second half, which is all of the routes that finish up the main story while also having their own twists with romantic events around whatever character that route is about. All of these variations finish up the main story in different ways centered around that character, so it's like seeing different versions and outcomes. There's also a little entertainment here. All of the romance in this game is considered light romance, and there's a lot of comedy. Once you get to know the characters, they get into a lot of crazy and funny antics that had me constantly laughing. Now, the more interesting and controversial parts of this game's story are the fact that in Japan, this was an H game that was filled with nudity and sex scenes. Obviously, a lot was changed, and some of the routes are drastically different. The Ageha route, for example, had a big part where she was constantly avoiding conversations by having sex with the protagonist. Obviously, that doesn't happen in this version. Not all of these things escape Western release. There are a few discrepancies that the text is clearly talking about what happened in the original version, and what's on screen with the characters is a little bit off. But that's not really a bad thing about the story. The story is really good, and if you didn't know it was originally an H game, you'd never be able to tell because of how well the storytelling is done for the characters and what they're trying to do. Now, the big downer part of the story is the translation. When this first released in the West on PC, it was known for a game that had a translation that was so poor that you couldn't even tell or understand what half of the story scene said. Thankfully, the translation in the Switch version is miles ahead of that original Western version. It's still got a lot of missing words and grammatical errors, but it is so much easier to understand than the original. When it comes to gameplay, this is a pretty typical visual novel. As you go through the game, you'll be navigating through story scenes and occasionally making dialogue choices to move yourself towards character routes and character endings. Now, first of all, let's clarify a couple things. There's not really that much difference between the PC version of this game and the Switch version outside of the different translation. Everything all the way down to the user interface looks pretty much the same. The second thing is the fact that this is just the base game of If My Heart Had Wings. The fan disc that had a bunch of prologue and sequel stuff dubbed If My Heart Had Wings Flight Diary is not included here. Now, progression in this game is very simple. You go through story scenes and you do dialogue choices when they pop up, but you don't really do that many dialogue choices. There might be half a dozen across the entire game, so it's not like you have to remember a million different answers if you want to get on a certain ending. What you do have to remember is the fact that a couple routes are locked until you've already cleared the game once. The Amane route, which has the most backstory on why everybody's doing what they're doing, doesn't unlock until you go through the Kotori route at least once. So if you want to get as much information and context as possible, you're going to have to go through the game at least twice. Now, as far as features go, it's still pretty typical VN stuff, like auto-advancing and skipping text, creating save files, and doing quick loads and quick saves. The latter of which we're going to come back to in the next section. Being a game with 2 different halves, there's quite a bit of content and length here. I managed to finish the common route in about 10 hours and got my first ending in around 18 to 20 hours. Note that I mean 18 to 20 hours total, not 18 to 20 hours just for the character route. So even if you only want to get one ending in the game, you're going to get at least 20 hours of it, which is plenty of time for that $20 price tag. Now let's talk about controls for a minute. Most of the control scheme is pretty good outside of the quick load and quick save features being tied to ZL and ZR. This is mostly a problem because if you accidentally tap the ZL button, it's going to reload the quick save, and that might be on a completely different route several hours of gameplay earlier. There were a lot of times that this happened to me when I was just setting the controller down so I could go out and make lunch or go to the bathroom. Now let's dive into presentation, which is pretty good. All of the art is very detailed, and there's a lot of beautiful event artwork for all of the different routes. The game's music is also very well done and does a great job of setting the epic atmosphere around what the Soaring Club is trying to do. In terms of performance, there are a couple things we need to talk about. Some of the menus lag a bit and freeze up. Whenever you hit the X button to open up the log, it normally takes about 5 to 7 seconds to load, whereas every other menu only takes about 1 or 2 seconds. This longer time can also lead the game to freeze up on you. I only had this happen a couple times in the game, but I remember once when I went to save, the game just kind of froze up trying to load the save menu and I had to eventually close the game and restart it. And finally, let's go into battery life. For the original model, If My Heart Had Wings has a battery range of 3 hours and 11 minutes on high settings, up to 4 hours and 12 minutes on low settings. And on the V2 or Redbox model, it has a battery range of 5 hours and 31 minutes on high settings, up to 6 hours and 31 minutes on low settings. Now, in conclusion, If My Heart Had Wings is a great story if you like aviation and romance in your visual novels. On the downside, the game's got some inconveniences with its trigger controls and the menu lagging and freezing every so often, along with lots of errors and discrepancies in the translation, despite being worlds better than the original PC English translation. But despite this game being flawed, it still has a great story filled with romance and a lot of laughs. Reviews to Go rates If My Heart Had Wings for the Nintendo Switch a 7.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.